My husband told everyone I was crazy for suspecting him. His phone rang during the toast. My husband's phone rang in the middle of a toast about loyalty, and the man calling him had no idea he was speaking to a ballroom full of people. Graham had connected his phone to the hotel sound system 10 minutes earlier so he could play a surprise anniversary video. When the screen lit up, the call routed through the speakers before he could reach the table. A man's voice filled the room and asked whether he had convinced everyone I was unstable yet. Then he reminded him that the forged psychiatric evaluation had to be filed before he could move my shares and leave with him. 200 guests went silent. Graham looked at me as if I had made the phone ring through sheer force of insanity. For 9 months, he had trained everyone in that room to see me as a paranoid wife. In less than 20 seconds, his own phone gave me back my credibility. The toast was being held at the Bellwether Hotel, where I had worked for 11 years and managed operations for 6. The event was supposed to celebrate the hotel's centennial restoration and the 10th anniversary of the charitable foundation Graham and I had created after my father died. Graham stood beneath a chandelier with one hand around a champagne flute and the other pressed theatrically to his heart. He had just told our board, our friends, and both sides of our family that marriage required patience when the person you loved was struggling to distinguish fear from fact. Nobody needed him to say my name. They all turned toward me with the same careful sympathy I had been receiving for months. I had not known he planned to discuss my mental health in public. I should have been shocked, but humiliation had become his favorite form of evidence. Every time I objected to a lie, he presented my anger as a symptom. Every time I stayed calm, he called the calm unnatural. He had told my mother I was sleeping badly, told my closest friend I had begun imagining conversations, and told our family doctor that I was experiencing obsessive jealousy. He never made one accusation large enough to sound cruel. He built the story in small, reasonable pieces until the people who loved me began asking whether I had taken my medication. There was no medication. The prescription bottle he kept photographing beside my bed belonged to his late father. My suspicions had begun with numbers, not perfume or lipstick. Graham's consulting company received 3 unexplained transfers from vendors that worked with the Bellwether. His calendar showed late meetings in suites that had been marked vacant. A man named Marcus Vale appeared repeatedly in security access reports, even though his contract had ended months earlier. When I asked about him, Graham smiled with exhausted tenderness and said I was connecting unrelated details because grief had made me hypervigilant. He suggested therapy. I agreed, believing a neutral professional might help us communicate. The therapist he selected turned out to be an associate of his attorney, and the private notes she produced described statements I had never made. By the night of the toast, Graham had already persuaded half the board that I needed a leave of absence. He believed the other half would follow once he announced gently and publicly that I was unwell. What he did not know was that I had spent the previous 3 weeks preserving access logs, vendor invoices, bank records, and copies of the false clinical notes. I had not confronted him again. I had learned that truth was useless when delivered to people who had been prepared to call it a delusion. I needed his plan to become visible without my interpretation. I never expected his phone to do that work for me. The caller identified himself when Graham finally snatched up the device. Marcus asked why he was not answering and whether his wife was nearby. His voice still echoed from the speakers. Graham disconnected the call, but the damage had already moved through the ballroom. His mother lowered her glass. Our attorney stopped writing. The chairman of the hotel board stared at Graham with the expression people wear when a familiar room suddenly reveals a hidden door. Graham tried to laugh. He said the call was a prank and glanced toward me, preparing to make me responsible. Before he could speak, the phone rang again. This time, a message preview appeared on the projection screen. Once Claire is declared incompetent, transfer the Bellwether voting shares before Friday. Beneath it was a photograph of Graham and Marcus kissing inside Suite 814. Roland Price called an emergency meeting. He treated the shortage as an embarrassment rather than a crime. Marcus presented a preliminary review showing that my credentials had accessed the service elevator and the 8th floor secure corridor at 11:42 that night. I had been downstairs managing a medical emergency involving an elderly guest. More than 30 people had seen me in the lobby, but credentials were considered stronger evidence than memories. Marcus said access codes could be mishandled without malicious intent. His tone was sympathetic. Graham sat beside his as the project designer and avoided looking at me. I requested the security footage. Marcus said the relevant camera files had been corrupted during a server migration. Our head of security, Daniel Cho, looked surprised, but Adrian ended the discussion before he could speak. He ordered a confidential internal review and temporarily suspended my administrator privileges. I left the room, understanding that my marriage and career were not separate disasters. Someone had used my identity inside the hotel, and both women with reasons to lie were sitting across from me. Daniel found me in the loading dock 10 minutes later. He had worked with me for 9 years and did not waste words. The primary footage had been deleted, but the Bellwether system maintained a rolling disaster recovery copy on an isolated server. Only Daniel and I knew the backup existed because we had installed it after a ransomware scare. Restoring a specific night would take hours and create an audit entry. He asked whether I wanted him to do it before the internal review team locked him out. I told him to preserve everything, follow chain of custody procedure, and notify outside counsel. I did not ask him to show me anything privately. Part of me wanted to sit in his office and search until I found a harmless explanation. The more experienced part knew evidence becomes fragile when a desperate person touches it alone. Daniel called the hotel's independent attorney, Margaret Ellis, and restored the files in his presence. By midnight, they had enough to ask me to come in. Margaret met me in a windowless conference room beneath the ballroom. A laptop sat on the table beside 2 sealed evidence drives. Before he played the recording, he warned me that it involved my spouse and might be painful. I thought I was prepared because Graham had already admitted the emotional affair. I expected a private conversation, an embrace, perhaps one kiss that would turn his careful confession into another lie. I did not expect to see Graham enter Suite 814 at 10:16, wearing the red dress he had told me was for a client dinner across town. Marcus arrived 11 minutes later. The hallway camera had no audio, but it did not need any. Marcus slid an arm around Graham's waist. Graham pulled his closer. Their kiss lasted long enough for the motion detection marker to divide it into 2 recorded events. They went inside and did not emerge for 73 minutes. When they did, Graham's hair was loose, Marcus carried his shoes, and both of them were laughing. My body reacted before my mind did. My hands went numb. I stared at the timestamp because numbers were easier than faces. While they were in the suite, someone wearing a catering jacket entered through the service corridor. The person used a cloned version of my access code, opened the counting room, and wheeled out the charity safe inside a laundry cart. A second camera captured Marcus meeting the cart near the freight elevator. Graham stood watch at the corner. The safe returned 40 minutes later. The seals visible on the outside appeared unchanged. Daniel enlarged the image and showed me a small cut along the bottom edge of one security band. Someone had opened the cash case, removed money, and replaced the seal with a convincing copy. At 1:08 in the morning, Graham used a cloth to wipe the door handle and elevator panel. Then Marcus entered the security office with Adrian's temporary executive card and accessed the camera server. There was more. The system recorded Marcus deleting the primary footage. He did not know that the deletion itself triggered a mirrored log on the isolated backup. Graham stood behind his reading instructions from his phone. At one point, Marcus turned and kissed him again beneath the security office camera. The casualness of it was almost worse than the scene outside the suite. They were not overwhelmed by forbidden feeling. They were comfortable partners completing a task. I watched the full sequence twice. On the second viewing, grief gave way to detail. Graham knew which cameras had blind spots because he had reviewed sightlines during the renovation. He knew my access code because he had seen me use it at home during an emergency call. Marcus knew the server migration schedule because he had requested it. Their affair had given them privacy, but their scheme had given the affair a purpose. I could no longer tell whether they had fallen in love and then committed a crime, or planned the crime and discovered that betraying me was part of the excitement. Margaret asked whether Graham had access to my work devices. I told him about the shared tablet and our home office. He advised me not to confront his, not to change visible routines, and not to remove anything from the house without guidance. The hotel's insurer and law enforcement would need to be notified. Daniel disabled the cloned credential without alerting the internal dashboard. We agreed I would remain officially suspended while they examined whether the theft was part of something larger. Driving home, I remembered every time Graham had called me paranoid. I remembered apologizing for noticing that Marcus's perfume lingered on his coat. I remembered counseling sessions Graham had suggested but never scheduled, anniversaries shortened by sudden client crises, and a weekend when he claimed food poisoning while hotel records later showed Marcus occupying Suite 814. The affair was not a single boundary crossed in confusion. It was an architecture of lies, and I had been living inside it. Graham was asleep when I arrived, or pretending to be. I stood in the doorway and felt a strange distance from the man in our bed. Only hours earlier, I had still thought of his as my husband who had hurt me. Now he was a person who had helped frame me for felony theft. The distinction steadied me. I moved to the guest room, locked the door, and wrote down everything I could remember while the timeline was fresh. The next morning, Graham made coffee and asked whether the hotel had found anything. I said the backup systems were complicated. His hand paused above the sugar bowl for less than a second. Then he told me I should cooperate fully and not let my defensiveness make me look guilty. He suggested that I may have left my code somewhere careless. It was an elegant piece of manipulation, concern on the surface, blame underneath, and a warning that he already understood how investigators might see me. I asked whether Marcus had contacted him. Graham looked wounded. He reminded me that he had ended the relationship. He said continuing to interrogate his would make reconciliation impossible. I let my face soften and apologized. The apology tasted poisonous, but he relaxed. That reaction confirmed what the cameras already had. He did not want forgiveness. He wanted control of the story. For the next week, I lived two lives. At home, I acted uncertain and ashamed. I attended one counseling session with Graham and listened while he described the affair as an emotional refuge created by my long work hours. At the hotel, I met Margaret and two detectives in a rented office across town. Daniel provided access logs. The charity's forensic accountant traced the missing cash through a network of shell vendors that had received inflated payments from the Bellwether redevelopment budget. One vendor, Northline Spatial, supposedly supplied custom lighting fixtures. Its invoices carried Graham's approval and Marcus's financial authorization. The company had no warehouse, no employees, and a mailing address at a private mailbox. Over 18 months, the Bellwether had paid it $640,000. The charity theft had not been their first crime. It had been a temporary cash grab meant to cover a payment that auditors were about to question. The detectives believed a third person had moved the safe. The catering jacket obscured the face, but gate analysis and parking records pointed to Marcus's younger brother Owen. His debts included sports betting and a recent civil judgment. Phone records placed him near the hotel. He was arrested quietly on an unrelated probation violation and began cooperating before Marcus knew he was missing. Owen said Marcus had described the scheme as harmless redistribution from wealthy owners who would never notice. Graham created fake design changes, Marcus approved vendors, and Owen transferred money through accounts opened under other people's information. My credentials were their insurance policy. If the charity shortage triggered scrutiny, evidence would lead to me, the operations manager with complete building access. Graham had supplied photographs of my identification and samples of my electronic signature. Hearing that hurt differently from seeing the affair. A kiss could be explained as selfish desire. Copying my passport, tax records, and signature required calm preparation. Graham had stood in our home office while I slept 10 feet away and assembled the materials to ruin me. He had kissed me good morning after deciding I was disposable. Margaret wanted more evidence connecting Marcus to the shell accounts. The detectives could move immediately on the theft, but arresting them too soon might leave most of the money hidden. Owen said Marcus kept an encrypted ledger on a portable drive and carried it whenever he feared an audit. Graham did not know the full account structure. That imbalance explained why Marcus appeared confident while Graham seemed increasingly tense. We set a controlled pressure campaign. Adrian announced that outside auditors would review every redevelopment expense and that suspended employees might be reinstated if the security data cleared them. Daniel allowed a false rumor to spread that corrupted footage had been partially recovered but was too damaged to identify faces. Margaret scheduled an internal hearing for Friday and required Graham and Marcus to attend separately. At home, Graham began watching me more closely. He asked what I remembered about the charity night. He wanted to know whether the medical emergency had kept me in the lobby continuously. I said I was confused and might have gone upstairs for a few minutes. Relief moved across his face before he concealed it. He encouraged me to tell investigators that uncertainty. I realized he was trying to make my own statement support the forged access records. That evening, he attempted tenderness for the first time in months. He sat beside me on the sofa and rested his head on my shoulder. He said losing me had frightened his into understanding what mattered. I remained still while remembering his laughter in the hallway. His affection now felt like someone testing a locked door. When he kissed my cheek, I wondered whether he could feel how completely I had left the marriage. I did not sleep. Near 2 a.m, Graham slipped out of bed and took his phone into the laundry room. A monitoring warrant allowed detectives to capture his call to Marcus. Graham said the recovered footage might show more than they expected. Marcus told him not to panic and reminded his that I was the only person whose credentials appeared in the official logs. Graham asked what would happen if I remembered seeing Owen. Marcus's response was cold. Then they would make my instability the issue. The following day, Graham told our therapist that I had become obsessive and forgetful. He described me misplacing keys, repeating questions, and imagining patterns. Most of the examples were invented, but some were ordinary mistakes stretched into symptoms. I understood the next layer of their plan. If evidence surfaced, Graham would portray me as an exhausted manager who had stolen money and constructed an affair accusation to deflect blame. Marcus had financial records, Graham had intimate credibility. Together, they could make truth look like a breakdown. I asked the therapist for a private minute after the session and gave him Margaret's card. I said there was an active investigation and requested that he preserve his notes. I did not explain further. The therapist's expression changed as he understood that Graham's clinical-sounding narrative might itself be evidence. For once, I watched one of their traps close without me inside it. Friday arrived with heavy rain. The internal hearing took place in the Bellwether's old press room, a dramatic space Adrian used for board meetings. The restored printing machinery remained behind glass along one wall. Marcus arrived in a gray suit with an attorney. Graham wore navy and carried the leather portfolio I had given his on our 5th anniversary. I entered last with Margaret. Graham looked genuinely startled to see me. He had expected a frightened, suspended employee, not someone represented by the hotel's independent counsel. Marcus recovered faster, he whispered to his attorney, and placed a small black drive inside his portfolio. A detective watching from the adjacent room confirmed the movement through a live camera. Adrian opened the hearing by stating that the purpose was to review credential misuse and financial discrepancies. Marcus presented first. He described weaknesses in my access management, periods when I had worked alone, and alleged tension between me and hotel ownership over denied bonuses. His slides were polished. If I had not seen the footage, I might have admired the construction. Every true fact was positioned beside a false implication. Graham followed. He said our marriage had been strained and that I had become secretive about money. He admitted an emotional attachment to Marcus, but insisted they had never been physically intimate. According to his, my jealousy might have influenced my account of workplace events. He spoke with sadness rather than anger, offering himself as a reluctant witness against someone he still loved. When Margaret asked whether Graham had ever entered Suite 814 with Marcus, Graham said no. When asked whether he had been at the hotel on the charity night, he said he left before 9. When asked whether he had accessed my identification documents, he said spouses naturally shared records. Each answer tightened the case. Margaret did not challenge his. He simply recorded the denial. Marcus's attorney requested that the hearing end because the questions had become personal. Adrian looked toward Margaret. He nodded to Daniel, who dimmed the room. The first footage shown was not the affair. It was a clean lobby recording proving I had remained with paramedics from 11:19 until after midnight. Then came the service elevator, the cloned credential, and Owen pushing the laundry cart. Marcus's expression hardened. Graham's mouth opened slightly. He looked at me as if I had broken an agreement by possessing the truth. Next, Daniel played the hallway camera outside Suite 814. Graham watched himself kiss Marcus. His earlier phrase, "never physically intimate," remained on the transcript in front of every board member. The room became so silent that rain against the windows sounded like thrown gravel. I did not watch the screen. I watched Graham understand that the version of reality he had built was no longer available. The recording continued through the removal of the safe, the wiped handles, and the deletion attempt. When Marcus appeared in the security office, his attorney told him not to say anything. He reached for the portfolio containing the black drive. 2 detectives entered before his hand arrived. Graham turned to me and whispered that I did not understand. I told him he had already had 10 years to explain who he was. It was the only direct sentence I gave him that day. Everything else belonged to evidence. The detectives executed warrants for the drive, phones, and financial records. Marcus was arrested for conspiracy, theft, fraud, evidence tampering, and identity-related offenses. Graham was arrested minutes later. He began crying only when an officer removed the portfolio from his hands. His grief seemed directed less at me than at the collapse of options. Owen's cooperation led investigators to accounts holding most of the stolen redevelopment money. Northline Spatial connected to 2 more shell companies and a condominium purchased for Marcus through a trust. Graham had received smaller transfers disguised as design consulting fees. His total share was $190,000. That number appeared in newspapers months later, but to me it represented something more intimate: the price he had accepted for my reputation and freedom. The scandal moved quickly once charges became public. The Bellwether's owners issued a statement clearing me of wrongdoing and reinstating me with back pay. Adrian offered me a promotion to Chief Operating Officer. I did not accept immediately. He had ignored warning signs, allowed Marcus to control an investigation into his own conduct, and treated missing charity money as a reputation problem. Being proven innocent did not make the institution trustworthy. I negotiated instead. Daniel received independent authority over security. All executive credentials became subject to dual review. Vendor approvals required separation between design, finance, and operations. The charity was repaid with interest from the hotel's insurance recovery, and Adrian funded an external audit without limits. Only after those changes were signed did I accept the position. My personal life was less orderly. Graham was released on bond and prohibited from contacting me except through attorneys. He sent a letter through his lawyer claiming Marcus had manipulated him. He said the affair began during a lonely period and gradually pulled his into financial decisions he did not understand. The letter described his as vulnerable, flattered, and afraid. It never explained the copied passport or the therapist session where he tried to make me seem unstable. I filed for divorce. Our house had to be sold because prosecutors placed a lien on Graham's share. Packing exposed the archaeology of our marriage: ticket stubs, renovation sketches, holiday photographs, and a chipped blue bowl we bought on our first trip together. I did not hate every memory. That complicated the grief. The woman who betrayed me had also held my hand through my father's funeral and spent 3 nights helping me care for a sick dog. Love had been real, but it had not been strong enough to govern his choices. People wanted a simpler story. Some friends called Graham a monster and expected that to comfort me. Others asked whether I had missed signs because I worked too much. Several disappeared because remaining neutral felt easier than confronting what he had done. My brother Nolan stayed. He helped me pack without forcing conversation and removed every photograph only after asking. He understood that healing was not a dramatic declaration. It was a series of small permissions. The criminal case lasted 14 months. Marcus initially blamed Owen, then Graham, then Adrian's accounting culture. The encrypted drive defeated each version. It contained payment schedules, forged invoices, credential data, and notes about possible scapegoats. My initials appeared beside the phrase, "operational access plus marital instability." Graham had added comments about my work habits and medical history. The document transformed their private cruelty into organized intent. Graham eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. His attorney asked me to support a reduced sentence. He said he had no prior record and had been influenced by a more sophisticated offender. I declined to recommend a number, but I submitted a victim impact statement. I wrote that the stolen money could be measured and repaid. The damage to trust could not. Graham had used the privileges of marriage as tools: access to my home, records, routines, vulnerabilities, and instinct to believe his. He had not merely hidden an affair. He had converted intimacy into evidence against me. Any sentence should account for the fact that I could have lost my career and freedom if a forgotten backup server had not preserved the truth. At sentencing, Graham looked smaller than I remembered. He apologized to the court, the charity, the hotel, and finally to me. He said he had told himself each choice was temporary until the choices became a life he could not escape. I believed that part. People rarely wake up and decide to destroy everything. They make one selfish exception, then another, and eventually protecting the exceptions becomes more important than protecting anyone they love. The judge sentenced his to 38 months in federal prison and restitution. Marcus received more than 10 years. Owen received probation and home confinement because of his cooperation. None of the sentences gave me satisfaction in the way strangers expected. Accountability was necessary, but it did not restore the person I thought I had married. Therapy helped me separate vigilance from fear. For months, I checked door locks repeatedly and studied faces for concealed motives. I hated that Graham had made suspicion feel responsible. My therapist reminded me that trust was not blindness. Healthy trust allowed questions and survived verification. What Graham demanded had been surrender, not trust. I moved into a smaller apartment overlooking the river. The first night, I slept on a mattress surrounded by boxes and woke before dawn. For one panicked second, I reached toward the empty side of the bed. Then I remembered where Graham was and why. I made coffee, opened the balcony door, and watched delivery trucks cross the bridge. The city continued without consulting my grief. At work, we rebuilt systems that had depended too heavily on personal confidence. I required documented approvals even when executives complained about inconvenience. I taught managers that internal controls were not accusations. They were ways of protecting honest people from being asked to prove innocence after damage occurred. The bellwether became safer because I stopped confusing trust with the absence of safeguards. Daniel preserved one still image from the restored footage for the legal archive: Graham and Marcus entering the security office while Owen waited with the cart. I never kept a copy. The image had already taken enough from me. When the retention period ended, I signed the authorization allowing non-essential duplicates to be destroyed. Evidence had served its purpose. I did not need to build a shrine to betrayal. 2 years after the confession, the charity held another auction at the Bellwether. The same ballroom filled with donors, music, and too many flowers. This time, cash was counted under dual control and transferred immediately by armored courier. At the end of the night, Mateo handed me the final reconciliation report. Every dollar was present. I walked past Suite 814 before leaving. It had been renovated, renumbered, and painted a pale green. A honeymooning couple had placed a room service tray outside. I expected the corridor to trigger anger. Instead, it looked ordinary. That felt like victory. Nolan waited downstairs to take me to a late dinner. On the way out, the lobby camera reflected in the glass above us. For years, I had thought the security footage was the thing that ended my marriage. In truth, the marriage had ended earlier, in dozens of choices Graham made when he believed no one was watching. The camera had not destroyed anything. It had simply refused to participate in the lie. Graham was right about one narrow point. His affair had been emotional. It involved secrecy, dependence, shared ambition, resentment, and the thrill of building a world that excluded me. It was also physical, financial, and criminal. The word emotional had never been a boundary. It was camouflage. What I remember most now is not the kiss outside Suite 814. It is the moment after Margaret turned off the screen and asked what I wanted to do. I had felt hollow, humiliated, and frightened, yet my answer came without hesitation. Preserve everything. Follow the evidence. Do not warn them. That was the first decision of my new life. I used to believe survival would look like becoming impossible to deceive. I know better now. No one can protect himself from every lie without also protecting himself from love. Survival meant trusting my perceptions, requiring actions to match words, and refusing to carry shame that belonged to someone else. Graham had tried to write me into his story as the jealous wife, the careless employee, and the convenient criminal. The footage gave me facts, but I was the one who chose not to disappear inside his version. The divorce decree arrived on a bright Tuesday morning. There was no dramatic hearing, only an email from my attorney and a stamped document ending 10 years in a few formal paragraphs. I printed it at work, signed where required, and put it in the secure shred bin after saving the official copy. Then I returned to a meeting about fire code upgrades. The ordinariness was almost merciful. That evening, Nolan and I ate by the river. He raised a glass to beginnings, and I told him beginnings were overrated. Most lives did not restart cleanly. They continued with scars, better boundaries, and furniture that no longer matched. We laughed, and the sound did not feel borrowed from an earlier life. Months later, I began seeing a woman named Lena, a museum archivist who understood why preservation and release were not opposites. On our third date, I told him the broad shape of what happened. I expected the familiar fascination people showed towards scandal. Instead, he asked what made me feel safe now. The question was so simple that I nearly cried. I told him safety meant being allowed to notice. It meant a question did not become an accusation merely because the answer was uncomfortable. It meant privacy without secrecy and independence without punishment. Lena nodded and did not promise he would never hurt me. He promised to tell the truth, even when the truth made his look bad. It was a smaller promise than forever, and because of that, I trusted it more. The Bellwether eventually received an ethics award from the City Hospitality Association. Adrian wanted me on stage for the photograph. I agreed only if Daniel, Mateo, and the accounting team stood beside me. Systems had saved me, but people had chosen to use them correctly. Daniel preserved the backup. Margaret protected the evidence. Mateo questioned a deposit that others wanted to dismiss. Truth rarely arrives through one heroic revelation. It survives because several people refuse to look away. After the ceremony, a young manager asked how I had known Graham was lying. I told him I had not known at first. I had noticed inconsistency, and I had made the mistake of believing love required me to ignore it. The lesson was not to distrust everyone. It was to stop treating discomfort as proof that a question should remain unasked. I sometimes receive messages from strangers who read about the case. They ask how to recover deleted footage, how to confront a cheating spouse, or how to know when an explanation is false. I cannot solve their lives. I tell them to protect records legally, seek independent advice, and avoid confronting someone who may destroy evidence or become dangerous. Most importantly, I tell them that a minimizing word does not change the size of an act. Just emotional, just one mistake, just money, just a marriage that had already become difficult. Every just in Graham's confession asked me to subtract my own reality until his choices seemed small enough to forgive. The security footage restored scale. It showed timestamps, doors, hands, faces, and deliberate steps. It turned abstraction back into action. I no longer define that year as the year my husband cheated on me. It was the year I learned how betrayal recruits silence, how institutions prefer convenient explanations, and how evidence can protect a person who has been trained to doubt himself. It was also the year I discovered that dignity is not something another person grants by treating you well. It is what remains when you refuse to help them mistreat you. On the third anniversary of the charity theft, I stood in the security room while technicians replaced the last server associated with the old system. The backup machine was obsolete, its fans loud and its casing scratched. Daniel asked if I wanted to keep the data plate as a souvenir. I said no. We watched the technician disconnect it and carry it away. For a second, the empty space on the rack looked larger than the machine had been. Then, a new unit slid into place. Lights blinked, systems synchronized. The hotel continued recording entrances and exits, not because everyone inside was untrustworthy, but because memory is imperfect, and power needs accountability. I went home to my apartment, where Lena was cooking badly and singing confidently. My phone lay unlocked on the counter, not as proof, not as a test, but because I had nothing to stage. He looked up and asked how the replacement went. I told him the old server was finally gone. He understood I meant more than equipment. He did not ask whether I felt closure. Closure suggests a door that can be sealed so completely the room behind it stops existing. I did not need that. I needed the past to stay where it belonged, visible when necessary, and incapable of controlling the next step. That night, rain moved across the windows in silver lines, reminding me of the hearing at the bellwether. I thought briefly of Graham sitting beneath the darkened screen, watching facts reclaim the room. I did not feel triumph. I felt distance. The affair had once seemed large enough to consume my whole identity. Now it was evidence in a closed case, a chapter people knew about me, but not the most important one. The most important chapter was everything I built after I stopped accepting his definitions. During the investigation, I learned how easily confidence can imitate credibility. Marcus never raised his voice, and Graham rarely contradicted himself in obvious ways. They relied on listeners filling gaps in their favor. Each explanation was plausible when examined alone. Only the timeline revealed the structure. That realization changed the way I reviewed incidents at work. I stopped asking whether a story sounded reasonable and began asking whether all available facts could exist beside it. Reasonableness is a feeling. Consistency is something that can be tested. The most difficult nights were not the ones when I missed Graham. They were the ones when I missed who I had been beside his. I had once moved through our home without evaluating every object as potential evidence. I had believed a shared password was intimacy and an unlocked drawer was ordinary. Afterward, even kindness could make me search for motive. Recovery required learning that caution could be specific instead of permanent. I could protect financial records, maintain independent accounts, and still let another person know me. Adrian apologized privately for allowing Marcus to lead the preliminary review. His apology mattered less than the policy changes that followed. I told him remorse without altered authority was public relations. He did not enjoy hearing it, but he signed the reforms. That conversation taught me another distinction Graham had blurred. An apology describes the speaker's feelings, while accountability changes what the speaker is permitted to do next. When reporters called, I refused television interviews. I did not want my worst week converted into dramatic background music. I released one written statement focused on the charity, the recovered funds, and the importance of independent controls. Some articles still reduced the case to a sensational love triangle. I could not control that. I could control whether I performed pain for strangers who would forget my name after the next scandal. I later discovered that Graham and Marcus had used Suite 814 on at least 6 earlier occasions. Those recordings had aged out of normal retention, but reservation patterns and key logs remained. Each date corresponded with a night Graham had described as work pressure. I stopped trying to rank the betrayals. Counting them did not make the truth more true. One deliberate lie would have been enough to require change. Hundreds merely explained why change had become unavoidable. The charity director sent me a handwritten note after the money was returned. He said the missing funds had delayed housing grants for families leaving domestic violence shelters. Until then, the theft had felt centered on me because my credentials were used. His letter widened the frame. Graham and Marcus had called the money abstract, but every stolen dollar had belonged to a planned roof, deposit, or locked door. Their scheme had victims they never bothered to imagine. At the plea hearing, Marcus did not look toward me. His attention remained fixed on the prosecutor and the calculations that might shorten his sentence. Graham looked repeatedly, searching my face for something I could not identify. Perhaps he wanted hatred, because hatred would prove a bond remained. I gave him nothing. Indifference was not yet natural, but boundaries sometimes begin as disciplined behavior before they become peace. My mother asked whether I regretted marrying Graham. I said regret was too blunt. The marriage led me to friendships, skills, and parts of myself I would not discard. I regretted the years I spent negotiating against my own perception. I regretted every apology I offered merely to end a conversation in which I was correct. Those regrets became instructions rather than punishments. There was no single morning when I woke healed. Progress appeared in absences. I realized I had gone a day without replaying the footage, then a week without searching Graham's name, then a month without checking whether strangers believed his. The nervous system measures freedom quietly. It loosens a shoulder, lengthens a breath, and allows an ordinary evening to remain ordinary. People often asked whether the cameras invaded privacy. The bellwether recorded public corridors, secure work areas, and access points under posted policies. It did not record inside guest rooms. The distinction mattered. The footage did not expose a private bedroom. It documented actions taken in shared and protected spaces during a theft. Graham had tried to use privacy as a shield for conduct that endangered others. Privacy deserves protection, but secrecy does not erase accountability. During the investigation, I learned how easily confidence can imitate credibility. Marcus never raised his voice, and Graham rarely contradicted himself in obvious ways. They relied on listeners filling gaps in their favor. Each explanation was plausible when examined alone. Only the timeline revealed the structure. That realization changed the way I reviewed incidents at work. I stopped asking whether a story sounded reasonable and began asking whether all available facts could exist beside it. Reasonableness is a feeling. Consistency is something that can be tested. The most difficult nights were not the ones when I missed Graham. They were the ones when I missed who I had been beside his. I had once moved through our home without evaluating every object as potential evidence. I had believed a shared password was intimacy and an unlocked drawer was ordinary. Afterward, even kindness could make me search for motive. Recovery required learning that caution could be specific instead of permanent. I could protect financial records, maintain independent accounts, and still let another person know me. Adrian apologized privately for allowing Marcus to lead the preliminary review. His apology mattered less than the policy changes that followed. I told him remorse without altered authority was public relations. He did not enjoy hearing it, but he signed the reforms. That conversation taught me another distinction Graham had blurred. An apology describes the speaker's feelings, while accountability changes what the speaker is permitted to do next. When reporters called, I refused television interviews. I did not want my worst week converted into dramatic background music. I released one written statement focused on the charity, the recovered funds, and the importance of independent controls. Some articles still reduced the case to a sensational love triangle. I could not control that. I could control whether I performed pain for strangers who would forget my name after the next scandal. I later discovered that Graham and Marcus had used Suite 814 on at least 6 earlier occasions. Those recordings had aged out of normal retention, but reservation patterns and key logs remained. Each date corresponded with a night Graham had described as work pressure. I stopped trying to rank the betrayals. Counting them did not make the truth more true. One deliberate lie would have been enough to require change. Hundreds merely explained why change had become unavoidable. The charity director sent me a handwritten note after the money was returned. He said the missing funds had delayed housing grants for families leaving domestic violence shelters. Until then, the theft had felt centered on me because my credentials were used. His letter widened the frame. Graham and Marcus had called the money abstract, but every stolen dollar had belonged to a planned roof, deposit, or locked door. Their scheme had victims they never bothered to imagine. My husband said his affair was just emotional. The security footage told a different story. The courts told another. The financial records told another still. But the final story belongs to me. I believed what I saw, protected the truth, and walked away before his lies could become my life.